Welcome to Within You, a place where we explore the liminal space between as we navigate between now and what's next. I'm Vivian Carrasco, wisdom teacher and mindset mentor based in Fort Worth, Texas, and I'm so excited to be in your ear. This is a new version of our podcast, and these are the first few episodes. Today's episode is actually a conversation that I had with Dan Simon. Dan is the host of the It's Personal podcast, and we had a pretty exciting dialogue between each other. I would love to hear your thoughts, your curiosities, or any questions that you might have pop up. Feel free to email them to me at vivian@viviancarrasco.com. I hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. This is Dan Simon, and today on our podcast, we're with Vivian Carrasco. Welcome, Vivian.
Thank you, Dan. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You and I know each other a little bit from our mutual experience attending the Chip Conley's Modern Elder Academy in Mexico earlier this year. So we have a little bit of a history together. But for our audience's benefit, I always like to start out with having you tell us a little bit about your life in only 6 sentences.
Oh, that's a beautiful prompt.
And we prefer that you don't use a lot of ands to extend that to 62 sentences.
Yo soy Viviana. I am Vivian. I am coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas, where I live with my husband, and I like to say his dirt bikes because he's an avid mountain biker. And I am the mother of 2 grown men who are both my sun and moon, and I am becoming. So that last sentence, and I counted down 6 sentences, leaves it open to who I'll become and what I am now.
Okay, I need one more sentence because one of the sentences I didn't give you credit for. Fort Worth, Texas, you don't get credit for, sorry.
You know what? I'm going to share. I think in this moment, I'm feeling a little bit of a ruckus maker. I like to stir people in a way that includes a tiny bit of skepticism, their own volume level, and curiosity. And I really enjoy the way that I do that as a teacher and mentor for my online community within university. That's where I find a lot of my joy and feel like I'm on purpose and doing my vocation in the world.
So let's start there, Vivian, because you're well established as a coach and with an online community, and I know you're doing a lot of different things. But tell our audience about the things that are important to you in your life now in terms of how you're contributing and what's happening in your world today. And then maybe we'll rewind and we'll work backwards about how you got to where you are today.
So the most important thing to me is the way that I am being. It's not so much what I'm doing, but it's the sort of method of travel. I would share with folks that I've had sort of an evolution of how I move through the world from kind of a type A, driven to achieve, and very focused on meeting the self-perceived box or persona of what society and my culture wanted from me. And about 6 years ago, I had a near-death experience and a real melting of who I was that took about 7 years to get through. And when I came out of that, I transformed into a person who's not that and who is more about relating, creating things that matter to me, and really exploring the things that make me curious. If I were to describe that shift in one sentence for you, Dan, I'd say that for most of my life, I kind of ran away from what I was afraid of. And now I've shifted that sense of direction, and I am totally focused on moving towards what I love instead.
Wow. So let's stop right there because, the idea of this, and I don't know who said it, but we're driven in life by 2 different motivators. Either it's, which is what you just said, it's either we're driven by running away from what we're afraid of. We're driven towards what we desire. We're clear about what we want. And that's a more powerful thing. And, for most people in the world, and certainly for most of my life as well, I was driven by avoiding what I was afraid of and protecting myself. So tell me more about, until you had the near-death experience 6 years ago, how your life was and how you're affected by running away from things, because it certainly is, what most of us are taught. What was your life like before that?
Well, it's an interesting thing because on the outside, it doesn't look different to anyone, And I like to bring that into focus because I changed from the inside doesn't mean my entire outside had to, be kind of like broken down and like deconstructed and reconstructed. The outside way that I live looks exactly the same. A really practical example of that is in the past. This is so silly, but it's an illustration of how I'm different but still the same. I have always loved to dress really simply. I adore the color black, and 98% of my closet is black. But I struggled with that choice in the old life, right? Because I would see magazines and I would see women and I would see people who were just dressed beautifully and like with colors. And I thought that's what I'm supposed to be, and sort of fought against this choice that I had made for myself. And now I just accept it. It's who I am. And if somebody doesn't like it, that's for them. It's not for me. And I can ripple that into a lot of things that I do in my life. And it took a lot of, I don't know what, honestly, but it took a lot of shifting my mindset and the way that I saw the world in order to start to accept every little part of who I am. Another example is I wore my hair straight for most of my life, and I would fight the natural curls that I have. And I'd say not even 2 years ago, I started to like accept that this is my own kind of beauty. It's not the beauty I see or am drawn to, but it's mine. And so I take better care of my hair and appreciate the curls. So those are just two really practical examples of the difference between before and now.
That skill of appreciating who you actually are, of being authentic and just stopping and appreciating that is very profound. Because it's, again, as you talk about, we have these huge influences we've grown up with our whole life about, starting very young about how we were supposed to be, what we're supposed to do. And, that's part of our memory, a part of our body memory that we've learned. And that experience of how we get to actually recreating and finding out who we are and who we want to be in the future is a very unique process. And it takes courage and resilience to keep that, I guess, awareness and keep noticing, and to keep what you're saying, you keep deciding that I'm going to look at it a different way. And, it's so true what you said about, nothing has to change on the outside for everything to change for us on the inside, right? I think that's what you're saying.
Yes. Well, and I also had a lot of experience experimenting with changing things on the outside to make things different. And I came to learn that it doesn't matter. My mother would move around a lot. So I went to a lot of different schools when I was young. And with David having a 20-year career in the military, we moved around a lot. So I had the opportunity to sort of take off an identity. And I learned through those decades of just growing that it didn't matter where in the world I was or what I was doing. I was always the common denominator. And so when I accepted responsibility for that and sort of stood in that kind of self-mastery and self-awareness and self-exploration, like it's about me, and stop pointing fingers at whatever thing I was complaining about, then I felt like this deep shift happen. But what you just said, Dan, is totally spot on. And I want to bring it back to how you open that. The body remembers. And if we've built a habit of being, when we're unconscious, maybe when we're tired or hungry or a couple of other words, we default back to that memory. And so it is a persistent thing that you have to sort of draw your attention to. And we're designed this way. So I feel like sometimes I might step back into that old me, and then I was judgmental about, I should have known this already. I've already learned this lesson. But it has to be a continual reminder, refreshing. And it's kind of like our teeth. I had my teeth straightened, but I have to wear retainers in order to keep them straight, because when I don't wear the retainers, the teeth automatically go back to where they were before. And I feel like the same thing happens to our persona and who we are being in the world. We will default back to that lowest common denominator of who we were taught to be, unless we're conscious about who we're being. So you were profound in saying that takes a lot of remembering, like a lot of persistence in going back to that and that intention. Thank you for bringing that up.
You're welcome. One of the most interesting books I read was about golf psychology. It's a book called Your 15th Club by Bob Rotella. And the concept in that book is it was so meaningful to me, and I applied it to golf, and I had some success with that. But what he actually says is that most golfers tend to get very emotional about when they hit a bad shot and want to yell and scream. And when they hit a good shot, and we're talking more about men probably, but when we hit a good shot, we tend to be nonchalant about it. And when he says what you actually should do is the opposite, because the thing you have strong emotions about are what your body remembers. So if you're continually having no emotion about doing something good, and you're continually having these very strong emotions when you do something bad, when you hit it into the lake, you hit it into the woods, your body is going to keep giving you more experiences based on the strongest emotion you had. And that work of actually putting in what he calls the good shots journal, remembering all the good things that we did today or last week, or 20 years ago, if we don't remind ourselves because we keep track of it. And what I actually did was, and what he recommended is, you actually write down the good things that you did, the good shots that you hit, and you also, as much detail as you could, you put in the emotions, how it actually felt when you performed that action, you hit that great shot. And then you rehearse that and you replay that, because the fact is that we will all forget. If we did something good yesterday, it disappears. If we don't focus on it, it just kind of completely disappears, and we don't get the value of it. But the value we do get is if we've continually replayed the bad things, one bad thing that happened, one traumatic event that happened when we were very young, we can replay that, the feelings of that traumatic event, 100 times a day if we want, when it has nothing to do with what's going on in our life. And it just is amazing what can happen when we decide to look in the direction of the good things we've done and give ourselves credit for it, and don't put the same emphasis. But as you said, Vivian, those feelings are always going to come up, especially when we're tired or under stress. The old feelings just pop up. They're never going to go away 100%. But when you have that awareness that, oh, well, maybe that's not really who I am. Maybe that's just an old memory that I can change and have dominion over, and have, because I think that's what you're talking about, is how do I have the awareness now that I can take that personal responsibility for it, then I can change the body's response in a manner that has based on my own volition.
Yes, and I want to come back to your experience with that book. It's not just men, actually. It is the way that our brain is designed. There's my favorite I think he's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, Patrick, his last name is Hansen. So he uses this beautiful metaphor about our brain being Teflon for the positive, just letting those things slide off, and it being Velcro for the negative by design. So the ratio that, depending on who you're reading, says it's usually like 10-1 or 7-1. Like you have to have every positive experience just kind of like slides off unless you make it $1 million moment. And he said exactly the same thing you're saying, is you have to install it in your brain so that you can redesign your wiring, because we default to focusing only on the negative. And it's like a training that has to happen. And you do that exactly the way you said, by remembering the good things, by reliving them, by kind of immersing yourself in all of the senses of what happened in that good thing. And my tool for that is there's an app that I use where I take pictures, because my phone is with me everywhere I go. So I take pictures of things that make me feel happy or inspire awe or joy or wonder or something. And I make sure that I capture that in some way, even if it's like a picture of the sunset or anything. And then I can play it. I can rewind those $1 million moments and re-experience them, so that I'm, training myself to remember what's meaningful to me.
That's a great idea. What's the name of the app?
The one that I use is called Leap.
Yeah. Okay, I'll post that in the show notes, because that's the quickest way to create a memory or to create a new experience, is to look at a picture versus read your text. It's even quicker when you see that picture. It's worth 1,000 words, right?
Yeah, and you can remember, like your brain will bring you back into your imagination of that moment. And, you can, it captures sound too. So you can hear the sounds if it's the birds or if it's the ocean or whatever was like where the whole context of it is. The app is called Leap Second. I just looked it up.
Okay, I will post that, but that's a great idea. I'm going to definitely check that out. What, Vivian, would you say if you looked back? You mentioned a near-death experience. What would you say were the maybe three events, positive or negative, that you could look back and that had the biggest impact on your life as you sit here today?
Three events that had the biggest impact to my transformation or in general of my life?
Just in general, the most impactful to your life.
So the three events that I would say sort of shifted the direction of my life. The first one would be marrying my husband and us leaving our small town. So taking myself out of the context of West Texas and traveling the world with him. The second, and I'm going to clump two events together, see if you give me credit again. I want to be a good student. The second one I would say is raising both of my children. So they're adults now. They're 27 and 23, but they changed the direction of my life because they really taught me through experience what it is to love, like love at another level. So that's the second one. And the third one about me, I would honestly say it was that, getting hit by the car, because I was physically hit by a car as I was walking across the street. It was that near-death experience that I mentioned, way back in 2014, April of 2014, that helped me to see life at a different level. And when I came back to my body, like I didn't lose that experience, and it really just dissolved a lot of the fear and doubt that I had been carrying around, and almost gave me wings to actually start to share and teach and live a way in the world that wasn't really hiding from who I am and what my potential can be.
So, as much as you're comfortable sharing, I want to hear more about the specifics of the experience and what recognitions you had when, and as much as you recall or are comfortable sharing. Tell me more about the whole experience, what you actually remember.
Sure, I'd love to. And I'd love to hear myself hear it too, because over the years, our memory fades, but I feel like every time I go back to that moment, I install it again, just like we talked about. So
yeah,
I was physically hit by a car on my left side. What actually, like in form, happened is I was sort of flown into the middle of the intersection. While that happened, what I believe happened, and this is as close to words as I can make it because you can't really assign language to it. It doesn't hit the mark. It's like you're just pointing a finger towards it, right? But I experienced every loving moment that I had ever had in my life. I went through a movie of smiles and hugs and laughter and beauty and images. It was just like this fast forward and rewind at the same time of every loving moment I've ever had. And it just bubbled up this undescribable joy in me. And when that happened, when it was over, it felt like my body released any heaviness. And what I would describe that heaviness as was probably like maybe even like trauma, anything that my cells held on to as an experience, fear, doubt, like everything that I had gone through, like it just let it go. And when it let that go and it almost dropped, kind of like when water, like you're under a shower and it just falls, then I was no longer in form. I was no longer in my body. I was like mist everywhere. And as I remember it, it was like complete joy. It was like I was everything. And there was no wanting. It was is. I guess that's the only way I can describe it.
How long did it seem in time this experience was happening? Do you have any way of describing that?
A long time. Like it could have been, you can't, that's a really good question. Like, cause right now the first thing that came to my mind is years. It took years to do that. But when I was starting to say that, my brain was like, it couldn't have been years. So it's like I'm having this internal battle with even what I'm saying as I'm sharing it, because it just took all the time it needed. But in reality, I don't even know how long it took. It couldn't have taken more than a couple of minutes, because when I opened my eyes, I was back and I was like, whoa, There's a quote that I like to reference that kind of summarizes what I realized from that. Like, I changed as a person because of that experience, but what I recognized with distinct clarity, Dan, is there's a quote that's attributed to Mother Teresa, who's now Saint. I forgot what they named her as a saint. But there's a quote attributed to her that says, "I am a pencil, probably a short, stubby pencil without an eraser, in the hand of God." And that's what I recognized. I'm like, because I'm in form, because I'm in this body, I have the ability to create. I have the ability to make. I have the ability, like, to move things, just physically pushing like the mouse over. Like, this is not something that I'm going to have when I'm no longer here in this form. Because when I was missed, when I was everywhere, I was happy, but I didn't have the opportunity to sort of move things around, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason we're here, and there's a reason when we're not here.
Yeah.
So were the injuries pretty serious as well in terms of your recovery?
Thank you for asking. I was in shock for a couple of days. So I didn't feel the pain, but I was taken to the hospital and had x-rays and, like the ribs and that sort of stuff. But I was, I could still walk, talk. There wasn't anything, horrible. Like, I think that the car was coming to a stop. And it was interesting because I sensed that something was happening, but that I couldn't stop it. Like, I was already in the movie of it because it was 5 lanes of traffic and everyone was stopped. But I kept looking, like, you see me walking, right? And then the last lane was a turning lane. And I remember having eye contact with the driver and like recognizing, like, oh, he's slowing down, he's going to stop. But as I kept walking, like the right, I guess, bumper, like still like really hit me as I was walking. I guess he decided not to stop. So yeah, my injuries weren't bad enough to, other than, keeping me from moving around for a couple of days and really healing and resting.
So there was a spiritual reason for all of it, because it certainly wasn't a logical reason for it. Although I don't trust that when I'm in a crosswalk, I don't trust really anybody's going to do what they're supposed to do, regardless of what the sign says. I've learned that lesson. But spiritually, how did this understanding you've described, how did that stick with you in the days and weeks afterwards? How did you process all of it?
Again, it's hard to describe in words, but there's a quote that Julian of Norwich is said, and it's basically all is well and all will be well. And it really, I have been able to keep away or let go of, unless I'm tired or hungry or sad or, I let the emotions move through me. And I have this like an unshakable belief that all is well. And so what has stuck with me is not just like a optimism, because I'm grounded in reality that, you can't trust everything you see, or that everyone's going to do what they're supposed to do, but that all is well. Like, I'm exactly where I need to be. And when I'm not, I can feel that. Like, I can sense that tension inside my body. So I guess what's coming up for me is that I have a different relationship with my experience, and I'm able to recognize when I'm coming off my own path.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But the impact was then really pretty immediate in terms of, because I can see how that you can have these feelings, these understandings, but many of us might not be able to process them, or it might take maybe a longer time to really realize how important it is. But it seems like for you, it was just kind of integrated and internalized almost immediately. Would that be correct?
Yes and no. So yes, in my own experience of myself, I got it. Like, my eyes were opened. But no, in that I needed to understand, because I had this inkling that there was a teaching or a message that I was meant to share. But I didn't know how to do that, and I was scared of that before. And after this experience, I understood that it was just an evolution, like it would unfold as I took steps towards it. And that's really what has happened for me, and why I call Within University and the teachings that I share as a vocation, because I recognize that whether it bears fruit in this world or not, that's what I'm here to do. But it took me a lot of time, and I'm still unfolding that, to know exactly what that is in form, like what it looks like and what it sounds like and how I do it.
So tell us about within university with, I believe, parentheses around the U, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, I'll post all this for our audience to check out, but tell me about that as part of your mission and the message you're sharing.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that I always wanted to be a teacher in some form, and I didn't know what kind of teacher I was going to be. I had settled on being a university teacher, like a professor. So I have a doctorate, I have a terminal degree, but that wasn't really for me. So I named it within university because I now have my own school that I teach in, but it's really about being a guide and a mentor to folks that have made the decision to turn inward, to look deep within themselves for their own answers. Because when I was going through that process, and I mentioned it was about 7 years, I really didn't have a place or a person that I could go to or that I knew of that had been through what I was going through and that could guide me. And so that's what we do in Within You. It's a very intimate, very small community where we take seasonal journeys together, experiences that allow us to move into a shift or a change. Most of the members are women, and we just move through liminal spaces together in seasonal journeys. And I obviously do coaching and teachings in there too, but it's a lot like what you and I probably experienced at MEA, at the Modern Elder Academy. You have to experience it in order to integrate it into your being. And it's like you can't learn about riding a bike by reading books, and you can't learn to swim by reading instructions on how to do it. You kind of got to get in the water. And Within You is kind of a safe place to test out your new skills.
Yeah, you and I have, I think, a lot of similarities in terms of approach and values. And, I always have been a teacher and a mentor to some people and a coach, but it's almost always been unusual experiences. People that show up to work with me are usually quite different, and people that, for myself, I never wanted to put myself in somebody else's template of how to do things. And because I've always just kind of developed my own template, it's been, maybe more challenging, maybe it's taken longer, but the skill that I know you have, that I have as well, of working with people, either in small groups or individually, to really connect at a different level is really kind of a magical thing. And, what I found, I want you to comment on this as well, Vivian, but what I found is that, the reason I've been drawn to the work that I do is that every time I make that connection and find out where somebody is coming from or what stories they're telling themselves that aren't really true, and I'm able to remind them of what would be more true for them and who they really are, that it really helps me just as much as it helps them. So that's what is a powerful driving force for me to move through helping other people, because it's really what I need as well. And there's this interconnectedness that's what makes everything function versus, putting things in little compartments and following the little rules. And, for me, coaching is never about, just follow these steps, get up at 5 a.m. and do this, this, and this, and then meditate and blah, blah, blah. That doesn't really go very far, really get to people. It doesn't help people to get where they need to go if you give them a template or a formula versus really getting to what's unique about them and figuring out what's the help they really need. But what's your perspective?
First, I kind of just want to say amen to all of that you just said.
Thank you.
And amen is literally translates into I believe, because I believe that too. I think the only distinction I would make is you use the word remind. And I would say that my posture is that I help them remember what they already know, which is basically the same thing. And again, in the same vein, but a little bit differently, even though we're having experiences together within a container, that online community, their life is their teacher. And that's the experience that we're folding in. And that's how it integrates. And I have found that my experiences and my learning mirrors what the community is going through, but maybe on a different level, right? Just a slightly different, but it's the same awareness that needs to happen. So yeah, that interconnectedness and bringing in everything that's happening is freaking magical.
Yeah, it really is. And, I've gone through, most of my life as a pretty good know-it-all, and being able to have insight and tell people what they ought to do. And, it's taken me a long time to realize that's not the best place really to come from, of being the know-it-all, because I'm not learning anything if I think I know so much about you and what you should do. Let's take a lot of experience I've had that have been humbling for me and terrifying for me to get to a point of approaching things from really a different viewpoint, because I've got a lot of power and a lot of insight, but I certainly don't have all the answers.
And that's a good point. I think something that I would like to highlight is, as a comparison of Vivian before and Vivian now, and you've alluded to this too, Dan, in the past, I was about getting the right answers, right?
Yeah.
And now I'm more about asking better questions.
Yeah, as our mutual friend, our shaman in Mexico, his name is Saul, said to me, well, really all you have to do is ask and wait. And, as he says, you don't do nothing while you're waiting, but that skill of waiting for the answer to appear, which, I don't know, might happen in a day, it might happen in a month, might happen in 10 years, but that willingness to wait for the universe to deliver an answer versus, what I've had most of my life, which is the desire to make everything happen. I'll force it to happen, and I'm not waiting for anything, is, again, a different place to show up with, and a big challenge. But I agree with you, Vivian, that just figuring out what's a good question to ask. And some answer is going to appear sometime if you ask the right question. And if you're in too big a hurry and it's too impatient, usually you just make life more difficult for yourself.
Yep. When I asked the question of what do I do next, like what's the right step for me, that answer took 7 years to unfold. And that's the period of time in my life where I call the dark years, because everything seemed muddy, like confusion. You bring up a really, really good point, is that it takes time for clarity to come, and we aren't patient with how much time it can take. There's a saying that says, you don't step into the river until, the muddy river, until the agitation has settled. And that's what I recognized that I did in my life, is instead of stepping forward in the middle of that agitation, in the middle of that confusion, in the middle of that chaos, and just taking a chance on whether or not I was going to do the quote unquote right thing, I waited. I moved through the world looking, resting, reflecting, but until I was clear is when I stepped forward. And that process took 7 years. And in that process, I sort of had the metamorphosis, right? The transformation of allowing that liminal space to hold me until I was ready to give birth again to the new me. So yeah, yes, and more yeses, Dan.
And what comes through so much from you, Vivian, is this level of faith. And again, I think that for all of us, that decision to have faith, and faith to me means that, well, things are going to work out fine for me. That gives you the patience to wait. And, I just think it's worth inspecting when I go back to what you said earlier in terms of how you've created a beautiful, successful marriage and created 2 beautiful children, and how important that is in terms of how everything else around you has proceeded, because again, it seems that that's given you a strength and a grounding, so many. And I certainly have had challenges in my earlier relationships that when you're not grounded in that relationship, and I was married for 27 years, but there was never really secure grounding and footing, and it was always some confusion. The waters were always somewhat muddied, but I want you to comment on that, because you've certainly referenced it, how important that your family and what you've created has been to how you've been able to move forward in life.
No, I will agree with you that love is an elixir, but love in the bigger sense of love, not love in the pizza love, I love pizza, but love in the sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, right? It's an undescribable word. But I want to step back a little bit and say that it was a co-creation. It was an allowing of us to each become. I've been married to my husband almost 30 years, but I would say that I've been married to 3 different people, 3 different personas, 3 evolutions of him. And so we've both sort of almost like if you can imagine right now a DNA strand, the way that a DNA strand is like apart and then grows together, intersects, and then comes apart again. That's how I sort of envision the movement or the rhythm of us. And because we are able to create independently, but then come back together, that's how I would describe that, our relationship. And the same thing, but different with my sons. Because I went through a really serious grieving period when I had an empty nest, because a lot of my identity revolved around being the mother of boys, like of being a mother raising children. And it took, I don't even know how to, I mean, this is probably, I don't even know how it happened, but somehow I went from that mourning of that identity and that role into this recognition and awareness of, but look at who they are now. Like, look at what they're becoming and how you're dancing with each other in relationship. So it was a co-creation, both them being the three of them, right? My two sons and my husband being supportive and also having our own identities and recognizing what matters to each of us and finding a way for that to fit. I have a really cool story to share about that. Do you want me to share it now?
Yes, please. I was just thinking of anxious to read the book because there's certainly a book about that transition from that identity of being a mother where your children are dependent upon you and to taking a different role. And I'm going through that. My partner's going through that with her only child going to college this year. My boy, I've got two boys as well, as you know, that are 31 and 28, but you can't hold on to the same relationship you had growing up. It's got to transform to something completely different. But I'd be anxious to hear the story, but also to read the book about that. And also the book about the transitions in turning in your relationship with your husband into three different people and how that transpired, I think would be fascinating as well, because it just can't be, here's what we got when we're, 18 years old and things just going to stay the same and we'll live happily ever after. It just, life is much more complicated than that. So I'd be interested in reading that book or hearing that story in another podcast as well, because it's really important and everybody's got to figure out how to do that in one way or another, and most have not. So yes, tell me the story.
Before I do, I just want to tell you that I'm sort of kind of grinning in not a Cheshire cat way, but in a really grateful way for you to even say that, because I am in the middle of birthing a book and it is like this current transformation happening in my life. So thank you for drawing attention to how those stories matter and why I need to share them. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome, because they are so, so, so important. So I will support you any way I can to get those stories out, because the world needs to hear them.
Thank you, friend. So the story I want to share, because it's super practical and it probably everyone listening can relate to it in some way, is allowing that shifting to happen because we've been married so long and we've gone through so much together, we kind of have figured out the big stones. And what I've recognized is that we were having little tiffs or arguments around the toughest decision of the day. And for us, it's like, what are we having for dinner, right?
Okay.
It really was. It was like the hardest decision I have to make every day is like, what are we having for dinner? Which to me means, where are we going to go eat or what are we ordering? And the story of me accepting that as my way and not the cultural way of cooking like food for my family, that was never fun for me, is a whole nother vein. But this one is about David and I actually moving through what the better question is. Because I had developed this loop in my mind that it didn't matter to him what I wanted for dinner. It was just sort of a pretend question, right? And the way that I would bring in evidence of that is, we might be parked in front of a restaurant and he says, is this okay with you? Right? And I'm like, we're already here. Like, that's not a real question. But one of the things, and I don't know, and hopefully when I tell the story in writing, it'll unfold like sort of the details of it. What I recognized that we needed to do is really identify what was under the rug. Like, what's the real question that both of us are asking each other that we don't have to negotiate an answer. Because when we find that, you're not letting anything go that you want, and neither is the other person. I believe that that's where we meet. Like, we meet at the root of what we want. So through probably an 8-month period and me noticing this and kind of dancing with it, I recognized that question he was actually asking was related to his need for novelty. Like, I need to have a different kind of dinner than I had for lunch or that I'll have for tomorrow. So he's moving through this movie of, if I had Chinese for lunch, maybe I want Mexican for dinner, and tomorrow I'm having Italian, right? And the need that I was trying to meet and fulfill is the experience of it. Like, is it beautiful outside? Do I want to eat on the patio? Do I want a more intimate environment? Do I want to stay at home? Like, that's where like we had to meet each other, not in the question that we were asking at the time, which is, what are we having for dinner? But in recognizing where each of us needed to be met. And that's him with novelty and me with experience. And when we can consider that, like it's not an issue anymore, but it comes up. It's that whole remembering in the teeth retainer, right? Sometimes when he's tired, he's like, really? Like, we're doing this again? And I just laugh. I'm like, yeah.
That's a great story. For me personally, it resonates because I have, with my partner and I, we have kind of at the opposite ends of the spectrum with regard to structure, and she has more need for structure and routine, and I have more need for novelty and doing things that are fun. And we come from two different places. And so the question is not just like you said, it's not just the question, it's what's behind that. And finding what's really important to your partner is important.
Yeah. And it helps you meet in the middle where neither of you lets anything go. You still have your novelty and adventure and change, and she still has her security, right? And her sameness. But figuring out what that looks like in the real world to each of you.
Yeah, knowing what's the real decision we're making here. If you know what the real decision is, then you can make an accommodation, you can make a compromise. But when you don't get to the point of understanding what's the decision really about, then it's very easy to get frustrated or bitter or just to complain about it.
Right. And get stuck in that memory of, oh no, here we are again. Or, whatever it is that already happened, you're not allowing that new moment to emerge. You're not allowing or giving permission for something to be different because of our brain, right? This Teflon and Velcro for the negative, like your body's going to help you remember all the shitty moments of arguing about where you're eating or not being happy about what you decided. And it really is a practice. And I said 8 months because it really took probably 8 months to move through the whole emotions of it. Because I even remember when I was in this experiment, this was the topic I was focused on. My stomach would start to knot as soon as I knew it was getting close to dinner time. And I didn't know what it was about or why it was happening. And I recognized it was like me preparing for this not cool moment to happen, right? But yeah, it takes time. So that curiosity and noticing and allowing and giving permission for something new to be born, just let it take as much time as it needs to.
Vivian, I so enjoyed you sharing your story with us. It's been, I don't really even have words to describe the conversation. We're so way over time, and it's just so great that in the world of online podcasts, it doesn't really matter how far over time we are. Yeah. We are. I'm not even going to ask you to give back that time on the next podcast. But I would like to have you on in the future for another podcast so we can continue the conversation and dive in even more deeply into other subjects that are important to all of us. But I just want to thank you again for sharing your story for all of our audience. And it's been a delight to have you with us. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it.